Catholic faith and extraterrestrial intelligence? We're going there. I'll be right back. Welcome, gracious gang, to the Gracious Guest Show. I'm your humble host, Mike Creavey, here exploring all things wonder and awe, the intersection of faith and culture, and the mysterious on occasion. And that's what we're going to dive into here today. Before we do that, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it far and wide. There's some really interesting stuff here that I'm going to discuss with Dr. Paul Thigpen, dealing with the issues of extraterrestrial intelligence. Are there aliens in the universe? Are there other sentient creatures, sentient corporeal creatures like us? In other words, creatures with material bodies who have rational intelligence. Is that a completely crazy thing to think about and to talk about? Does that somehow contradict Scripture? Does that somehow undermine Christian faith if we would discover, indeed, that we are not alone in this universe? And with me to do that, as I mentioned, is Dr. Paul Thigpen. I want to share his biography. Dr. Paul Thigpen is an internationally known speaker, award-winning journalist, and best-selling author of 60 books, including Manual for Spiritual Warfare, and more recently, Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Catholic Faith. Are we alone in the universe with God and the angels? Which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Check out the links below. I wish I had a print copy here. I have the Kindle version of it myself, but definitely check it out. His work has been circulated worldwide and translated into 16 languages. Paul earned a BA in Religious Studies at Yale University and an MA and PhD in Historical Theology at Emory University. Now retired, Dr. Thigpen has served as a professor on the faculties of several universities and colleges, and as a member of the National Advisory Council of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Paul has been interested in UAPs, that's unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP studies since childhood. He was one of the speakers at the recent symposium on UAP studies hosted by the Soul Foundation at Stanford University. And he is also the author of one of the Foundation's recently published white papers entitled NHI, which is Non-Human Intelligence. NHI, UAP, and the Catholic Faith, How Will the Church Respond? And I'm delighted now to turn over to this interview, this really insightful, interesting, thought-provoking interview with Dr. Paul Thigpen on the question of the Catholic faith and extraterrestrial intelligence. Check it out. Dr. Paul Thigpen, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show here today.
Mike, it's a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is an exciting opportunity, and I said at the outset for folks watching this just a little bit about your background, but please, if you could, just share with us a little bit about your background a little more in depth, and especially what brought you into this sort of ambit, this interest here about these questions.
Well, I was raised in a Protestant home, and Presbyterian, and then eventually other things. Had a 6-year period from the age of 12 to 18 when I was an atheist, and it's kind of early to be doing that, but it happened. And
sure.
But all during that time, just as a matter of kind of scientific curiosity, had an interest in the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. So there may be other things out there. I love to look at the night sky and think, okay, is there something else out there? Could it be looking down back at the air? And so, I had a few experiences that kind of awakened me, I guess you might say, to that possibility. When I was in high school, I did one night on the beach with a couple of friends see what you would call UFOs. I mean, they were unidentified to me. May very well have had a prosaic explanation. They looked like two glowing discs, but almost like plasma, I guess you might say, with red and white. And then I had a recurring dream of stuff. And I'm not claiming that those were any kind of real encounters with things out there, simply that they enhanced and intensified my interest in the subject. Sure. But when I became a Christian at the age of almost 18, and well, I guess I had just turned 18, the topic stayed with me. And I wasn't Catholic right away. I only became Catholic 33 years ago. But throughout that time, began to read and to ask myself, if from what I believe, and I do believe what the Scripture teaches as a Protestant and as a Catholic, what the Magisterium teaches, what the tradition holds, is there room within that for the existence of intelligent life other than the human race and the angels? And So a couple of years ago, when New York Times published a piece talking about the government beginning to, admit that yes, they've been studying this for a long time, and there were some
Yeah,
things going on. That seemed to me to indicate this is the time to if I'm ever going to write about it, to write about it. And so
sure.
it's been about 2 years since I wrote the book.
Yes, yeah, and I first heard about it just in sort of the normal channels. I think you were on I think Pints with Aquinas, correct? I think with
That's right.
Matt Fradd talking about it, and that was a fun conversation as usual with him.
Yeah.
And and this has always been interesting. I think to me, similarly, so sort of in the background. I don't think there was ever any time in my life that I, from a position of faith, I don't think I ever found any contradiction. But maybe walk us through a little bit here. I know I had a bullet point down here I sent to you about how this has been sort of conceptualized throughout history, and that's obviously a big thing. That's what your whole book really focuses on. But maybe before I kick that off to you here, just to define our terms and make sure I've got this right. I've got some links below as well that you shared with me. They can check out for more details. So, is NHI would be non-human intelligence, correct?
Yeah, kind of a general term that would
Okay,
include things like ETI, extraterrestrial intelligence from another
sure.
planet, um, but also if there might be other kinds of intelligence. And when I use it, I'm not usually talking about AI, artificial intelligence, but I guess
Right.
some folks would put that in the category too.
Now, would that include, for example, in that case, would that also include, like angels, demons, in the sense that they're a rationally intelligent creature, but they're not human? But
Yes, and
obviously, in their case, they're purely spiritual. They don't have any physical sort of aspect to their being. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
yeah. This no, they're non-corporeal. They don't have bodies, and that's why the book that I
Right.
wrote, I didn't just call it, I call it extraterrestrial intelligence in the Catholic
Sure.
faith, but I made sure the subtitle said, "Are we alone in the universe with God and the angels?" Because
Right.
God is also intelligence, of course,
Right.
and non-human, and angels are that. So in a sense, the Christian tradition
Yeah.
has always specifically allowed for one form of non-human intelligence, the angelic form, which
Right.
includes the fallen angelic form, demonic
And I think
powers.
that's helpful for people because I think a lot of times there's a misconception just about what we are, what angels are, and so the theological precision is important. And I noticed, in your text and the articles you sent me too, you made this distinction about, we are. The answer is, are we alone? No, we're not. But maybe more precisely, are we the only embodied, rational intelligences that God has created? And so, uh, maybe give us a couple highlights just about how you discovered how far back this conversation really goes. It was fascinating.
Yeah, my PhD is in historical theology. It's called. It's that branch of theology that focuses on the historical development of teaching ideas
Yeah.
within any religion, but specifically for me within the Catholic and broader Christian tradition. And I like to say to folks um, how important history is in looking at theology. That imagine that you're late to a party and you show up and conversation's been going on for half an hour, and you walk up to a group and you hear them talking about whatever subject, and then you make a point, and they say, "Oh, he just said that." You say, "Oh, okay."
Right.
A little embarrassed, and then a few minutes later, you make another point. He said that 10 minutes ago, and you come to realize real quickly that the conversation has a history, it has a background, has
Sure.
developed a certain way, has using its terms a certain way, and especially within the Catholic tradition, more so than the Protestant tradition, and Christian more so than many others. That there's because it is tradition, that which is handed down to us from the past. The tradition is so important. The history, not just of the institutions, but of the ideas, the teachings, is
Hmm.
so important. And so, as an historical theologian, anytime I approach a theological issue or a cluster of theological issues, I'm going to look at the history of it. I'm going to look at how did uh, how did folks conceptualize the things that we're talking about? What were the terms that
Right.
they used, especially within the Christian tradition and the Catholic tradition? Did they allow for certain things? Did they rule it out? How did they argue? What conclusions did they come to? And most especially for Catholics, did the church ever take a formal, defined position on an issue?
Hmm.
And so
Sure.
that's kind of how I've approached it. The first section of the book is the history of the conversation. The second
Right.
half is looking at the theological issues in light of that history.
Sure. And maybe, again, there's a lot of texture to this and a lot of detail. You put early on, I have a couple highlights here I really enjoyed. So you say clearly, the primary concern of this book is to show that the Christian faith, as traditionally held by the Catholic Church, would not be contradicted by the public discovery or disclosure of extraterrestrial intelligence. So it seems like kind of the bottom line up front. And maybe walk us back here a little bit, like you were saying there, with the history of this. What are some of the challenges, like when you go back and look at, say, like the ancient Greek world? Maybe give us a couple details of how the way they sort of conceptualized the universe, or the cosmos, maybe is a better word here. That seems to come up quite a bit. That we see the word world right in English, but a lot of times it's a translation of that Greek term cosmos, which, right, does that mean planet Earth, or does that mean all of creation, all these kinds of things? Maybe can you give us a couple examples of how that's a challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I think we have to recognize that at the beginning of the Christian Church, the church fathers especially were many of them were well educated in their day. They're well trained, and that included study of the philosophy that had come to them from the classical world. So especially Greek philosophy, but also Roman. And among the Greeks, especially the two towering figures were Plato and Aristotle, and their notions of the cosmos, of all that is the universe, were highly influential. And so shouldn't be surprising to us that, and alongside that, then you do, of course, have the Jewish tradition, and the Hebrews' conception of the world. This is all very important. And so when you're reading the first few centuries of what folks had to say about extraterrestrial intelligence, creatures that might live on other planets that are intelligent, they tended to not even consider talking about life on other planets that was intelligent, because they were so deeply influenced by that Greek worldview, which insisted that the Earth is the center of all that is, the universe, and that the sun and the planets go around the Earth. And the planets, for them, interestingly enough, were just stars that wandered. They looked at the night sky and they saw that most of the stars went a particular direction, but the planets were going and not following that. That's
the etymology, right, of planet. Doesn't mean like wandering star, right? Yeah.
Sure. And so they didn't have a place, so to speak, in their heads for thinking about a rocky or gaseous ball on which intelligent creatures could live. Even then, it's interesting. You had some philosophers among the Greeks that said, "Oh, sure, there are things out there alive and intelligent." But even with folks like Aristotle, Plato, and their followers, there was this notion that the stars themselves were animated creatures, sentient animated creatures. And so right there, you've already got a notion kind of extraterrestrial intelligence, if you not on a planet, but the stars themselves were. And then the other thing we have to keep in mind is that, like the Greeks or the Romans, many of the early Christians considered that there were other forms of non-human intelligence, but they didn't locate them out there. So you have, for instance, St. Jerome, in writing about St. Anthony of the Desert going to visit St. Paul of the Desert, and describes an encounter that he has with the centaur and the satyr, two of the Greek mythological figures. And you say, okay, he was just repeating a story, and I'm certainly not saying that means that they exist. Could, I suppose, but then he goes on to say, and if you think they can exist, and then he gives this long explanation about, oh no, they really were, and there was one that was captured and brought to Constantinople or somewhere, Alexandria maybe. And so what it does demonstrate, though, is that St. Jerome, who's the father of biblical scholarship, or the greatest minds of the church, especially in the ancient world, that he did not see that as a form of non-human intelligence, even on Earth, as contradicting the teaching of the church. His contemporary St. Augustine, the greatest Western theologian of the ancient world, I would claim, also said at one point that there was so much testimony to human encounters with these kinds of creatures that as he put it, that the Greeks or the Gentiles wrongly worshipped, but that they were real. He said it would be imprudent to deny it. So you have already, even in the early, highly venerated church figures and thinkers, room for non-human intelligence. But they didn't say.
Well, and just to add here, Paul, because these guys aren't, this isn't maybe the strongest argument, but these guys aren't exactly like they're not exactly like superstitious buffoons or like these are pretty rationally astute, guys. So that's at least worth considering that they don't have a problem with that idea. Is pretty intriguing.
And the point again I'm making, and with other figures that I cite in the book, is not that if St. Augustine believed that it's true or St. Jerome believed it's true. It's that you can have a well-formed, highly respected and recognized Christian thinker who knew the scripture and knew the tradition and all those things, who by implication was saying this is not contrary to our faith. Saw that possibility. But there were still kind of, folks affected by the Greek model, where they didn't have a notion of planets where other things could live. Right. And so it wasn't until really the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, when with the coming of Galileo, the telescope, and other things, that people began to have a notion that planets were something else, and that there could be that. But even then, you have, again, St. Thomas Aquinas. He never considered being influenced so deeply by Aristotle that there were planets where things could live. He also was open to the possibility that the stars themselves were sentient and living beings. So for all of them, there was room for non-human, non-angelic intelligence out there. And then by the time you get to the 15th century, you begin to have figures like Nicholas of Cusa, who highly respected in the church. He was a papal legate, a papal advisor, was at the Council of Basel, the Ecumenical Council, highest levels of respect in the Catholic Church. And he said, no, Aristotle's wrong, and talked openly about how he thought, it's likely that there were other forms of life out there. And he was one of the first kind of to make that major break. But as soon as, especially with Galileo, as soon as the folks figured out, we're not the sun, Earth is not the center, and these planets are something else. And you know what? The whole notion that the Earth is the center was never really part of our Christian faith in the first place. It's an attitude. It's something that we assume, and we should keep in mind with Galileo. People often say it's the church against the scientist, or faith against reason. It wasn't that at all. The people of the time, the scientists questioned it, the philosophers questioned it, the church questioned it, everybody questioned it. This notion that Copernicus was saying, which is an ancient idea, that no, the Earth goes around the sun. And
well, the Copernican model needed some work. Like it wasn't perfect out the gate either. There were highly scientific churchmen who said, "Hold on, let's look at this closely."
The ironic thing, I love it, that Galileo, and he had all kinds of problems. He got himself into a lot of his own trouble, but when he discovered the moons of Jupiter, which were a very important kind of thing through his telescope to support his theory, he, in true scientific method, he needed to find independent verification of it. So by other scientists who would have telescopes, to whom did he go? To the Jesuits. The Jesuit astronomers have always been central to astronomy. There are craters on the moon and stuff named for many of them. And they confirmed it. So again, it wasn't just like reason against faith. It was, the world was waking up to this idea that they'd had this notion that the Earth is at the center, and it's not really part of the Christian faith. It's part of our, you might even say, pagan inheritance, and so we can let go of that. You get a similar kind of thing with the encounter with the New World. A lot of folks just kind of assuming that the land masses in the Eastern Hemisphere were all there were, and then all of a sudden we find out there are these living, intelligent creatures on the other side of the planet. What do we do? Are they even human? Some people would debate that. Do they have souls? And then
because there was a question about the how do these people go back to Adam? And we have trying to figure that out. Like, how do you trace back? And so that opens up a whole can of worms of like how old are we really? Where is the Bible being more perhaps figurative in its language, or it's not so much focusing on scientific language, but telling the truth that this did happen? Like, of course, all those questions, I think they started to get a whole new impetus to them to study.
I love with St. Augustine, for instance, someone presented with the issue of what were called the antipodes. And that just means feet going the other direction. So antipodes was the notion that on the other side of the Earth, and everybody thinks, they thought it was just a flat. No, there are plenty of people who thought either it's a sphere, or at least it has two sides, hemisphere. could there possibly be humans on the other side of the earth? And he said, no, but his reasons were that number one, that the church teaches that all humans are descended from Adam. And number two, we see that the oceans that go around the land we know are impassable. And so if they're there, they wouldn't be human,
right?
Or whatever. And he was basing it on kind of the science of the day and the technology. What he didn't know is that, first of all, there had been a land bridge at one point for people to walk across. But even aside from that, that it was possible to cross the ocean in certain ways. Right. At least to follow the landmass around. If he had known that, then he wouldn't have objected. So, similar kind of thing with this kind of issue. But so once you get, again, once the science starts saying, there really are other planets out there, that kind of thing, then you find all kinds of openness among Christian theologians of all kinds to this possibility. And again, not just maverick folks, not heretics, not people who are way out there, but folks who knew the faith well. Once the Reformation started, same with Protestants. That's not to say that you didn't have some theologians who said no, can't be, and took the other position. I never argue that it was a universal agreement. Very, very little in church history that everybody's agreed on.
Sure.
But what it did demonstrate was that within the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is an important part of the tradition, there had, from the early centuries, been openness to the possibility that we are not alone with God and the angels, that there could be other intelligent creatures on earth, beyond earth. And it's more a matter of, we need to discover that.
Yeah. Well, and do you think, I wonder here, Paul, is this, so the people who would say, let's say from a Christian perspective, and there's different reasons people will say that oh, this is just all nonsense. There's no extraterrestrial, so you could have maybe a secular atheist person that would maybe make the argument based on, we don't have good enough evidence. Okay. But from the perspective of faith, I'm just curious, what your take is on this, and to go a little bit more in detail. You certainly cover this, in your book a good deal. Do you think, though, that this is an artifact of within more of a broadly speaking, a Protestant tradition, an over reliance on a sola scriptura mentality that might even be bleeding into Catholic circles without people realizing it, where Christians or even Catholics themselves might press pause or think that this somehow the Bible says there's no aliens or there's no possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence because they're not explicitly mentioned in Scripture. I mean, is that possibly what might be at the heart of some of this? Because and one follow up, because I've also heard, and I know you've heard this way more than me. What do a lot of people then do when they seem to be there? They jump to, there's videos, there's books, there's stuff all over the place. It's got to be demons. Right, Jimmy Akin always brings this up, right? That whole it's always demons mentality. So what do you think about that, and what are some of the dangers we run into, and also some of the really exciting, interesting things we cut ourselves off from if we kind of lock ourselves into that idea?
Yeah, I think there's several roots of that kind of resistance. One would be the sola scriptura, and you had Catholics argue that before. The argument from silence. It's not explicitly in Scripture. Number one, you might be able to question that. There are a few passages where you have to wonder, and people have speculated about. But more importantly, especially in the book of Genesis, the creation story, the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs or microbes or platypi, but they're all we all know they exist. Interestingly enough, you actually had a movement within Protestant fundamentalism that's still alive today. I don't know how many people adhere to it. The idea that dinosaurs aren't in the Bible, and the existence of dinosaurs would mean a very old Earth. But we know from our faith, they would say that that can't be. And so when presented with the evidence, physical evidence of dinosaur bones and fossils, they say, well, they're so convinced that those can't be real, that they're willing to go so far as to say, well, either the devil created or crafted those things and put them in the earth to deceive us, or God himself made them and put them in there to test our faith and see if we would believe the Bible.
Right.
So that's
or
pretty far out.
to like setting a play, is like as if these things existed millions of years ago, but they didn't, which I always thought was a stretch.
Yeah. But I guess the
Yeah.
point I'm making is that if you've already made
Yeah.
up your mind that they can't exist because of your faith, you've got to go
Right.
to pretty far lengths for something like that to
Yeah.
say that they don't. And you get a similar kind of thing today with some of the evidence that we can talk about
Hmm.
for these things being real and active in the world. So you have kind of two major issues. The one is the theoretical theological issue: is it
Yeah.
contrary to the faith? And I think the book, the open-minded people would demonstrate no. First of all, the Catholic Church in particular has never denied it, never had a formal
Hmm.
definition rejecting it. Number two, there are no doctrines of the church from which you can make an airtight case that they don't exist. There are other ways to interpret certain scriptures that have been interpreted by all kinds of very good theologians,
Yeah.
that the scripture itself in particular doesn't even have that necessarily in mind, that the catechism does not have that in mind. You have some folks saying, well, the catechism says, for instance, that that we're the only ones made in the image of God. All you have to do is know a little bit of church history and theology, and you know that church fathers talked about angels in the image of God. St. Thomas Aquinas said they're probably more in the image of God than we are.
Hmm.
St. John Paul II, to just take a few examples from throughout history, had a whole series of lectures on in Rome on the angels and talked about how they're in the image of
Yeah.
God. Because the image of God doesn't include a body, but even
Right.
so,
Right.
that it's
Right.
not exclusive. So that kind of argument, I don't think just works. It doesn't work if you know uh, the biblical and the magisterial text.
Sure.
Others, tried to say that if it's unknown and they seem to have more of an emotional reaction. If it's unknown and it makes me uncomfortable, it's got to be the devil.
Hmm.
And we've seen that with other things. So let's see, what's the best way to go with all this? So we've got that issue, and then we've got the separate issue of unidentified aerial phenomena. You speak all UFOs. That's kind of the newer term.
Yeah.
We've got all that kind of evidence that you can't deny what is going on. So if you have already made up your mind that it can't be, and the only thing you can figure out would be demons, then you will take every single instance, and there are hundreds of thousands of them,
Yeah.
of anything like a jet pilot who knows his stuff, seeing particular things out in the air next to him, physical, that's got
Right.
to be a demon, even though it has no demonic characteristics at all. I've written books on spiritual warfare. I know
Right.
I know the demonic profile, I think, pretty well. And
Yeah.
you just can't put that category on most of what we've encountered. The so-called
Sure.
abduction experience, yeah, there are plenty of those experiences that sure seem to have parallels. I'm not saying they all
Hmm.
are, but to demonic possession, I've never argued that none of the cases of that kind of thing are demonic.
Right.
I think it's more likely that that the demons are counterfeiting other things that are real.
Right.
But that's, we can talk about that in a minute.
Well, and that's such a good point though, because it's not. I feel like it's not one or the other. It's not that like it's all demons or it's never. I don't think we're saying that. But I find it so intriguing. There's so many neat like potential tangents to go off of. Let me back up a little bit when you mentioned about. So a lot of people have probably seen the like the Tic Tac video and some of these now declassified videos, and that's what interests me. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I'm off track, but as I explain to my students a lot, because I teach theology to high schoolers, and when we get into angels and demons a little bit, and I recommend like to older students, sometimes I'll recommend Father Carlos Martin's, Exorcist Files podcast, which has some really good catechesis in it. Here you're dealing with a purely spiritual creature that is pure intellect, but who has forever decided to commit its will against God, right? Against against love. I describe it sometimes as like when you go in a beautiful like ski lodge and you see that roaring gigantic fire in the fireplace. I say that's like an angel, right? Perfectly in its right setting, and it's glorious, it's beautiful, it's comforting, it's welcoming, it's enlightening, But I say, what if like some of that fire jumps out right onto the carpet, in the lodge? It's just chaos. The same kind of power, but completely at odds with what it's meant for.
Yeah, great analogy.
The point,
yeah.
Well, the point I get to with them is I say, look, okay, you hear these scary things that demons can do in these extreme cases of possession, and it is scary. But part of why it's scary to us is because we can't possibly conceive of how this creature is so far beyond all of the rules we understand and are locked into, of like gravity and time and all that. It's not mysterious to them, so to speak. It's like parlor tricks. It's like a game to them. But then when I look at like the Tic Tac video, I'm thinking, but is there something in between potentially though? Is it possible that you have an embodied intelligent being that understands those rules way beyond what we do as well? Not to the level of maybe an angel or a demon, but because maybe talk a little bit about some of the things you've seen with at least some of these claims of this footage we have of like is it transmedium travel? Is that right? The idea that it's craft that can seemingly go from like upper atmosphere to lower atmosphere into the water, like just stuff that we can't at our current level of knowledge possibly account for.
Yeah.
Some of those are just fascinating things, the claims, at least in these hearings.
Yeah. I think we should, to that. Who was it? Was it Arthur C. Clarke, maybe science fiction writer?
Yeah.
I think it was, who once said something like that any sufficiently advanced technology will look to people who know nothing about it like magic.
Yeah.
And
I don't know how my toaster works.
Yeah, I can't figure out an air conditioner,
like, good gracious. I mean, yeah.
And so it's kind of that thing. It's not a lot of the things that we see them doing that we have, as far as we know, humans just don't have the knowledge of doing. It doesn't mean that these are spiritual powers. It just means that they've really highly advanced technology, apparently. So they call them the observable, the 5 observables. The transmedium travel is one. They can come from outer space.
Yeah.
We actually had on
this
Fox
is documented
News broadcast one
like,
time.
This is right.
Very highly, former intelligence official of the government admitting, and everybody said he said it on Fox News
on TV,
that we had footage of stuff coming in from outer space, coming through our atmosphere then and going into water. In some cases, and it's on film, apparently going through solid things like the side of a mesa.
Oh, jeez.
So transmedium through different kinds.
I'm getting heebie-jeebies. Yeah, the hair goes up. You're like, jeez.
But also then, hypersonic travel. Travel that's extremely fast.
Yeah.
In some cases, for instance, things that are moving underwater. And a lot of them are underwater. They're not even flying things underwater. There's actually a nickname for them in the Navy that they can track by sonar, that kind of thing, that apparently are going faster than the speed of sound underwater without causing. I'm
getting like, do you remember that movie The Abyss from like the late 80s?
Yes,
I love that movie. There's some of those vibes.
Yeah. You've got them able to make sudden right turns, that kind of thing, at speeds that if human beings at least were in there, they'd be jelly on the wall.
Right. Or like the fuselage would just break up. Like,
all those kinds of things. And that also have the kind of stealth technology that they react to some of our tracking stuff in a way that shows us they're intelligently controlled. So I would say, one of my recommendations for folks is because even there are some scientists, including some Catholic scientists, who just say, I'm fine with the idea of intelligent life out there. It just can't be here because you can't go faster than the speed of light to get here. And so I'd say, folks like that, well, first of all, science is still progressing and growing, right? If you ever start to study quantum theory and quantum mechanics, realize there are all kinds of things.
You're assuming they're building a craft and flying from A to B. Maybe it's...
Or even, there are theories about being able to space-time as a fabric, being able to fold it in such a way that things, great distances can, to at least be open to that. But more importantly,
it's fascinating.
Look at all the evidence we've got, scientific material evidence for these things. There is something here. So you can go to the idea that they're already from Earth, they're already here. So that's a possibility.
Yeah.
But how are you going to account for all of that? Hundreds of thousands of cases of things, and for these kinds of things that we know just is not within our technology or technology of our adversaries. So if you've got, like with the Tic Tac and some of the other things, you've got human observers, you've got radar, you've got infrared, you've got other kinds of electro-optical sensors, and they all are targeted and they all agree. And it happens multiple times. And it happens in some cases out on the ocean every day for years.
Right.
um,
I'm an old Army intelligence guy, and just if someone whispers something, well, that's not intelligence. It might be a piece of information, or you need multiple confirmations. You need human intelligence to match up with signal. You got phone calls, you've got satellite. Like, the idea is you want to build this complete picture, and that sounds like what you're talking about. That these are not just rumors. And this reminds me, Bishop Barron talked about, like, for example, cases of like levitation, like Joseph of Cupertino's feast day actually is tomorrow at the time of this recording. And it just is like, just look at this logically, try to leave, you're skeptical. Okay, that's fine. But just, is it likely, is it likely that everybody's lying? Everybody? Like, all of these people are completely hoaxing? It's just...
Especially the credibility of so many of the witnesses, especially the military. You have so many military witnesses. And if
a lot of them don't have anything to gain, pilots, by the way, right? From
fact,
sharing this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
they put themselves at risk.
Of it.
Right?
But they're really intelligent. You got our top gun pilots, right, with the Navy.
Yeah.
Highly trained. They know how to recognize things that they see, and they're coming out and saying, "Yeah, it's out there. It's got this physical shape to it. Describe it. It does these things. It came close to us. It went around us. It's not." And for folks who say it's all American psyops, these are reported all over the world. The Chinese have them, the Russians, the Iranians. It's all across Brazil and South America. Japan has a bunch of them. Africa has them. Canada, could go on and on. It's all over. So one of the questions
I was an old psyop guy too, and I don't buy that.
Yeah. So one of the things we get to then, because we're talking about evidence, I think one of your questions about that. What do I find compelling? Not only is it compelling that we do have scientific, evidence, measurable evidence, and in some cases, trace evidence left behind by craft that were observed to land and leave, but also that the credibility of so many of the witnesses. They're so well trained, they're intelligent, they have nothing to gain and everything to lose by talking about this. But they're convinced. So someone like Ryan Graves, Navy pilot, he's finally started talking about it. He hasn't broken any NDAs, but he's talking about it, and many others, because he's concerned about flight risk.
Right.
Some of these things would come and get in the way, and they'd almost crash. And we have some cases where there's evidence that maybe they did actually lead to crashes. You've got folks like that. You've got former presidents. You've got someone like Jimmy Carter. Who's from Georgia, I met him personally, and he had an experience with seeing things. So
Harry Reid has talked a lot about this, hasn't he? Former
Senate
Majority Leader.
Yeah, he was the person who was responsible for getting funding for the black programs, the secret programs to study it. When the government, by the way, was denying that they were doing such a thing.
Right.
And they did it.
Was he in Nevada? Wasn't he at where a lot of those sites are and stuff?
A lot of connections right there. But the point being this, that and I'm not the first to say this. Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who's maybe wrong. I think he was at least an exorcist. But anyway, he was there in Rome in the Curia, and he talked about this a lot. And that because you don't like the subject or you don't like the possibility of it being real, if you're going to just disqualify it all because all this evidence, testimonial evidence, just because you don't like it and it seems extraordinary, you'd have to, try doing that with the Christian faith. I mean, try doing that with all of history. St. Augustine talked about that. He used to say, people would say, well, I'm not going to just take something on somebody's word or authority. Say, okay, well, let's start looking at how much you actually know, either by matter of reason or personal experience. So let's start with when and where you were born and who your parents are, and do you know all that from you were there, but
how much do you remember?
All the stuff you only know in the word of your parents. And I'd add, okay, do I know that by personal experience or pure reason that China exists? No, I have these pictures and people tell me. But used to do a test with my college students where we'd talk about, okay, you can have pure reason, you can have experience, or you can have authority, to make the point about how much we believe because of on the basis of authority, and then a whole quiz where you check which one of these is it.
Right.
And most of them ended up ultimately being authority. And even what temperature is it outside? Well, either you're taking the word of the weatherman, or you're looking at your thermometer, but you're going on the authority of the maker who said this is an accurate reading. I mean, you could, in so many ways, So much of what we
The
know.
whole scientific endeavor, and so much of it, I always tell my students too, the same thing, it's faith, like what John Paul says, right? Faith and reason together, those two wings, they
And
work together.
all of
Yeah.
Christian, the Christian witness is an historical thing. It's based on historical witnesses, the apostolic witness. If we say just because it's unusual, a man rose from the dead, that we've got to have some kind of something more than testimony, well, then where's your faith going to go from that? I'm not putting it on the same level as our faith for sure, but what I'm saying is the principle is there, that we do take so much authority, and at some point, for lots of unusual things in life, we have to take the word of credible witnesses, especially when they're in the thousands.
Yes.
And,
So, Paul, how do you think the church should respond? We're looking at a bunch of things here. I've got a few more questions, hopefully time permitting here. But again, this idea of all the news, the media fervor over all this. You mentioned some, at the time of this recording, some potential upcoming hearings. Let's say, as this goes on and more disclosures are made, it's kind of incontrovertibly put out there, hey, look, they exist. How do you think the church should respond? You've covered this in some writings recently, and I'll share those as I said below. But why don't you give us kind of your take on how this should be addressed from the church's perspective?
Yes, great question. It's if you look at history, what you find, and Pope Benedict XVI mentioned this in one of his books, that it looks like so many times that science discovers something new, and then the church has to play catch up to try to see how that relates to theology, and after the fact, a rear action, I think he called it, and that's true about a lot of things, it seems. But one of the reasons for my book was to help Catholics, other Christians, and non-Christians as well, understand that in this case, Catholic thinking in many ways has been out there far beyond others. So folks like Nicholas Cusa and others, there was, one of the writers from that same period, Forlong, was talking about the possibility of multiple universes and that kind of thing. Very similar, to some of the kinds of things that scientists are speculating about now. So all
this is like 5 or 6 centuries ago, right?
Yeah,
this isn't like in a few decades ago.
Yeah. And remarkable kind of breadth of vision. I'm not saying that that's true, but just that they did not see theology as this terribly limiting thing, but actually it opened up all kinds of possibilities because of a God who's all powerful and all wise and creative. And we see from what he already does that he fills things with life and all kinds of interesting things we'd never even known existed. We're still finding new forms of life on this planet, new species. And so in this case, at least, I would hope that the church, and by this I mean from the Vatican on down to the pew, that folks would begin to become knowledgeable about that history, that tradition that we have, that openness. But then second, that they would pay attention seriously to all kinds of information that's out there now about the evidence that we have, about the testimonies of all kinds from around, about the scientific evidence. A lot of folks don't realize those hearings in Congress that we've already had some of and more. The claims of highly credible, well-placed folks from the intelligence community and the DoD, the Department of Defense, are saying that, we've recovered physical craft and even bodies, and we've had it for decades. This is something that within folks studying this that we've heard about for years, but to have people in that position saying under oath they could be put in prison.
I never expected in my lifetime to hear that. Like, not, just like in a congressional hearing, like, that's
some pretty important evidence for Christians because demons don't have bodies and demons don't travel in craft. Again, you get folks trying to claim, in particular, that, well, they don't need it, but in order to deceive us, we can imagine them crafting things that look like that. To me, that sounds just like the devil crafted the dinosaur bones kind of argument. You've already made up your mind, so you're grasping at the straws to try to figure out, how can I explain this? Well, it must be, but the demons did it just to deceive us, or God did it to test our faith or something. So anyway, that's the first thing that Catholics and other Christians need to do at every level. Start informing themselves. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there. It always has been. The subject has always attracted a lot of kind of way out people too.
Right.
But there are places, you can go to get reasonable discussion of what's going on, to pay attention to the congressional hearings that are coming up, and to look at you can look online at the ones that have been. I'd love for him to read my book, but if not that, I wrote a paper
absolutely.
with the one paper for the Society of Catholic Scientists that then the Journal of Church Life at Notre Dame republished soon after, and we can give the links for that, to talk about the whole historical thing that we're talking about. But then wrote a paper for the Soul Foundation, which is based out of Stanford University, to start having more academics look at this in a serious way, this whole issue. They had their first symposium in November. I spoke there, so I can give you the link.
Is that the NHI UAP and the Catholic Faith? How will the church respond?
That's the white paper that I wrote. That's the paper I wrote, making proposals to the church. But then there's also there's a video of the presentation I gave, half-hour presentation. So it's kind of condensed. It's to a non-Christian audience largely.
Okay.
But those things to just begin to get familiar with it. And then they need to start doing the hard work of theology and a lot of history, and saying, okay, if tomorrow the U.S. government were to declare, or something landed on the White House lawn or whatever, and by the way, there's something very similar that happened back in 1952. There were UFOs going you probably know, in Washington D.C. All across for several weeks, several times, and they sent jet fighters after them, and all kinds of people saw them, and they had them on the radar. But the church needs to start talking about this, in particular, because number one, you do have some Christians saying it's contrary to the faith. So what's going to happen to those Christians and the people who believe them when we get the really firm evidence disclosed that it is? Are they going to cease to be Christians? I mean, I know one well-respected theologian, who recently in an interview commented and said, if these things were proven to be, I'm paraphrasing, but if these were proven to be real, then that would disprove Christianity. Oh my goodness. And because that's the argument we've had for centuries by anti-Christians, by people like Thomas Paine and others, who did believe that such things existed, but they argued that the existence of them disproves your faith.
Sure.
That's a really dangerous situation for us to be in. If Christians, Catholics and other Christians, don't really understand how our faith can accommodate this, and now we have a tradition of accommodating it, when, as evidence comes out, that somebody's going to lose their faith, they're going to get confused, it won't be good for them. And that's why I'm encouraging, in this paper that I wrote, is addressed to the Catholic leadership. It's a white paper, so it makes proposals saying, starting at the Vatican, here's what we can do in very practical ways to begin to think about these things, and help people, first of all, not to realize it's crazy talk, and second, to realize that if it's there, it's not going to damage our faith. It'll expand our horizons for sure. Right. Just as discovering the New World and discovering things in astronomy expanded our horizons. But it doesn't contradict our faith.
Well, and it's fascinating because, and again, you had the line here. I want to share two quick quotes, kind of in our closing minutes here, and maybe explore these. Where was this at here? Early in the book, you said, right, so though Earth had no special position as the center of the cosmos, in other words, like materially speaking, it was special because of God's relationship to the human race. And then you had this quote, I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Is it Presbyterian pastor? Is it William, is it Leitch or Leach? I don't know how you pronounce that. Or
spell it for me again. I'm
putting on the spot. Leitch. 17 or 19th century Scottish.
Leitch.
I love this. So he's the principal of Queen's College in Kingston, Ontario. And he's talking about this. And this is beautiful because this question of if they exist, are they fallen or not? And all the issues that brings up. I love this. And he says, the universe is a great harp, and each orb a string of that harp, but one string at least is untuned. One great end or purpose of redemption is to readjust this jarring string of our world. Scripture allows us to say then that even though our planet is not the material center of the universe, it's still the spiritual center. And Paul, that really got me thinking. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan. I love Tolkien. I love the way, I love Lewis's Ransom trilogy. And I just, I know Mars doesn't look like that literally, I know Venus, but every time I read those books, I just, they're more true to me then it just feels right. This idea of him encountering, they're kind of angelic beings, but are they something different? He encounters multiple sentient species in his journeys in this fictitious book. And the whole concept behind it is that we are the silent planet, right? We're the one that went wrong. And because God loves us so much, it basically reinforces the whole Christian thing, but in this really cool sort of sci-fi cosmological kind of way. And I love those stories. And to me, they just, like, that idea introduces so much depth that I have no problem with it, of course, theologically, but maybe you speak just about that here in our maybe closing minutes about, maybe your own take on this, or just what you kind of think about where we're at with this. There's differences of opinion. You mentioned Padre Pio too. Maybe we can mention that, because that blew my mind.
Yeah, I mean, because Padre Pio, and I've had folks try to question this. It's in 2 books that written
so
by people
blunt.
that knew him personally. One of them was one of his spiritual sons, as they called him, and published within a few years after Padre Pio died, published by an arm of the same ministry that order that he was a part of. So they would have known whether this guy was making wrong claims, I think. And in that conversation that he reports, Padre Pio not only says, of course, there are extraterrestrial beings on other planets, but that they're unfallen and they give God more glory than we do. Now, again, that doesn't prove it, but boy, in his case,
right?
Padre Pio was given the gift of seeing and knowing things that most of us can't know. He could read souls often. He could see things happening at a distance. He knew the future. God would reveal things to him. If I had been in that interview, my next question would have been, "Oh, Father Pio, tell me, do you say this because you're convinced, this is your opinion, firm opinion that they exist, or has God revealed something to you that we haven't had revealed?" Could have been. John Paul II, when he was asked in a public audience, a little girl, Holy Father, what about the aliens? And if it were true that it's contrary to the faith, and especially if it were true that the Catechism teaches that, as some people claim, who's the one man in history that would know that Catechism the best, be the best interpreter of it?
You have the Supreme Pontiff on the spot.
The one who commissioned it, the one who wrote the introduction for it, the one who promulgated, the letter for it. If anybody knew that book and how to correctly interpret it, would have been John Paul II.
Sure.
So he would have been morally obligated in that moment when she says, "What about the aliens?" to say, "Sweetheart, that's contrary to the faith." He didn't say that, and he didn't even say, "Well, we don't know. The scientists will have to show us." What he said was, "Always remember, they are God's children too." And just think about that for a while. The man who knew that catechism better than anyone else. Things like that. Maybe say, you really can't interpret the catechism to mean that it's they don't exist.
Well, and again, they're like bare minimum, right? Like, that's not a scientific proof, but bare minimum, there's like an encouragement to people, like, why be afraid?
Exactly.
Which
was part of, theme of his pontificate, be not afraid, right?
His pontificate, sure.
So, it's I just encourage people to learn more about it with an open mind, but mostly, even if you don't have time to learn much about it, if there should be some things coming out, maybe not in these hearings, but in other ways, it could be the scientific community that finally reveals certain things going on, especially things like, okay, yes, we admit it, we do have recovered craft and bodies. Don't let it shake your faith. That's the whole point of that book, and other things that I've spoken and written about. Yes, it will expand our horizons to find out that our all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite, eternal, creative God has created others that could even be, in terms of time, our elder brothers and sisters. But again, the beautiful thing is that, and this is a really important point I want to make, that one of the arguments against their existence is that God does have a special relationship with the human race, and therefore it would somehow dilute that or take away our special status if there were other intelligent races out there. And, St. Augustine, he wasn't dealing directly with this, but he had a principle that's right, where he said, God loves each one of us as if there were only one of us. Yeah. And that's true for the species as well.
For the species too,
And the thing is, any parent of more than one child automatically understands what he's saying there. That your first child comes and you say, "Oh, I love you so much. I could never love anybody as much as I love you," to the little child. And then the second child comes along, "Oh, I love you so much. I could never love anybody like I love you." You love them all. And having more than one does not reduce their special status or their place in your heart. So it's kind of an argument that, any parent of multiple children should be able to look at it and say, no, that doesn't mean we're not special anymore.
Well, look at the story of the prodigal son. That just popped in my head, right? The son who's the complete screw up, and and he shows some interest in coming home, and he gets all that attention and focus, and so the idea there that maybe we've got some older, like you said, some older brothers out there, and the challenge for them is to not be jealous, that we get that special treatment. I don't know.
And he, again, I think he can treat them all special, each in a different way. You can go back to Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, and even though he didn't have the notion of extraterrestrials living on other planets, he did address issues like God's way of salvation on earth is that the only way God could have saved us.
Sure.
And his answer is, no, he's God. He's
right.
Brilliant, intelligent, all these things. He could have done it more in other ways, but this is the way he chose for us. And so if you have other fallen races, God could have other plans for them. Christ is the second Adam. We're the children of Adam, basically. And so what he did for us wouldn't necessarily be part of the plan of salvation for them, except that I love the image of the harp needing a tuning on that that singular string, except that, first of all, that because he is God in the flesh, then he does still have universal rule. And second, that it could be that all of creation, as St. Paul talks about as longing for the redemption of the sons of God here. Why? Because we can't reach our perfection, our intended goal, without these doggone humans being redeemed. That's what they need. They've messed up. And another image would be, a symphony orchestra. If you have a solo, everybody has their part to play, and everything's going beautifully, and then one of the soloists, or even just one of the violins in the background, really messes it up.
Sure.
The whole, the orchestra, the symphony will not be what it's intended to be until that one gets it right.
That's right. Well, Dr. Thigpen, thank you so much for coming on here today to talk about this. I have so many more questions, but this is a good start for I think all of our viewers. I mean, we'll have all these links below. Anything else, what you have coming up soon, or just something that people should kind of keep on their radar?
Well, I've got a couple of possible projects, but they're not in concrete yet, so I won't say anything. But
we'll keep them. We'll keep that under the lid for now.
I just encourage folks to try to start looking into the issue, and don't pay attention to. There's a lot of weirdness out there. Don't pay attention to that. Just look at,
gotta discern
the stuff. Going on with Congress. Look at the stuff going on scientifically. The evidence that we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on today. I really, really have a lot of fun talking to you about this.
The fun and the pleasure was mine. Mike, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. God bless you. Take care.
You too.
Well, that was pretty eye-opening. And it really just was a very fun conversation to have. Very intriguing, very eye-opening, as I said, and something that I know for me is just going to continue to encourage me, I think, to go a little bit deeper. And this, is a challenging area. There's a lot of claims. There are a lot of purported pieces of evidence. But as we all know, photographic evidence is so easy to manipulate. Video evidence is increasingly easy to do the same. What I really love about Paul's book is that while he does discuss some of those things, some of those questions of hey, are we alone? Are there good reasons to believe that there actually are potentially sentient alien life forms that are out there, maybe some of whom have visited or are here now, all these kinds of questions. That's not really, I think, what his book is primarily focused on. It's primarily focused on this deeper question of if it is the fact that these creatures or creatures like them do exist, does that automatically pose any sort of problem for us as believers? Might it just be the case that God's creation is bigger, more interesting, more mysterious than we maybe realized? And so I encourage you to, if you're interested, go a little bit deeper, check out those great links below. Feel free to reach out to Paul as well. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.